While I certainly wouldn't say that every element of US foreign policy or every element of Israeli foreign policy or
how much of that is within the wish of the aggressors or the defenders?
In my time as Prime Minister was that efficient global supply chains have really changed the situation.
And prevention of Iran having its nuclear capacity.
A, totally destroy the Iranian war machine.
Welcome to the latest episode of Cross-Examination. It's a podcast that's intended to bring the law to life. My name is Giles Stapleton. I am the founder and host. Today, I am extremely fortunate to have with me the Honourable Tony Abbott, a former Prime Minister of Australia and a central figure in Australian politics even now. Tony, thanks again for coming. The rule of law is the question I have that I'm interested in from your perspective as a politician or former politician. What does the rule of law mean to you in your sort of life as a political figure?
Well, thanks, Giles. It's good to be with you. And I should stress in the presence of a practicing barrister that while I have a law degree, I have never practiced as a lawyer. Yes, I've served in the Parliament, and obviously I maintain a close interest in all things to do with our public life. But I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a barrister, I've never practiced. And so I'm going to give you answers which I suppose are politicians' answers, I guess public life answers, as opposed to the answers that you might get from a practicing lawyer. When I talk about the rule of law, the law is, in a sense, made by the Parliament, interpreted by the judges, and enforced by the police. Now, I know if you go back into the wonderful world of the common law as articulated by people like Lord Denning, yes, the law was in a sense discerned by the judges based on precedent and their sense of the inherent rightness of things. But these days, the law is very much what Parliament says it is. And of course, what Parliament says the law is can then, I suppose, be, as it were, applied by judges before it's enforced by the police. So the law is incredibly important. What distinguishes countries like ours from some other countries is that the law, because of the work of elected legislatures, because of the work of judges who are independent of the legislature and are appointed for life, and the operation of what we like to think are honest and efficient police forces, the law has a respect in countries like ours, which it doesn't always have and probably doesn't deserve to have in very different systems, which are not democratic, where judges and police are very much the servants of the state or the servants of the party in power.
And I think today you appeared in The Australian and there was a line that's very interesting for me, which was the fantasy of international law.
Well, that's right, because compare what we know of as law in Australia with the so-called international law. There's a legislature, there's a judiciary, and there's an enforcement. Now, the United Nations is not really a legislature. The international tribunals are hardly courts in the sense that we know them, because many of the people on them are really agents of governments, perhaps the Chinese Communist government, commonly enough, and there's no enforcement. I mean, in the end, if there is no enforcement, it's hard to think of it as a system of law, as opposed to, at best, a kind of a wish list of what we might aspire to in a world that really did operate in much the same way as the system of law operates in a country like ours.
And I think it causes confusion within Australians as a result, because there's a lot of activity in the world at the moment, and in the Middle East, and then also in Eastern Europe, where we have standards that we've been led to believe are commensurate with our civilized society, and then there's uncivilized behaviour going on everywhere. How do we reconcile our values and views with what's going on around the world?
Well, it's a good question, and obviously different members of the Australian community take a different approach. I, for one, have never spoken about the Russian attack on Ukraine as an illegal war, because while it certainly is, as far as I can work out, contrary to international law, in the end, what counts is that this is an aggressive, unprovoked attack by a global bully against a country which has never done Russia any harm other than perhaps by existing. And so what the Russian dictator is doing here is put into practice just the latest stage in his oft-stated desire to rebuild the Russia of Peter the Great, to overcome what he has frequently called the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So for me, the evil of the Ukraine war is not that it's illegal in inverted commas, it's that it is an aggressive war being waged, at least on Russia's part, without any regard for the ordinary rules. Ukraine is doing its best to respond in a proportionate way, defend its territory, to target military installations beyond its territory, whereas Russia is plainly engaged in a terror bombardment of Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. So that's my problem there. If we look at something that has been described as an illegal war, the 2003 American-led attack on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, sure, it was not authorised by the Security Council, but there were plenty of Security Council resolutions against the weapons of mass destruction that in the past Saddam Hussein had used against his own people, and which he was widely assumed still to possess. Now, I suppose the higher and more ultimate purpose of the 2003 Iraq War was to rid the Iraqi people of a dreadful dictator, a dictator who was sponsoring terrorism. Now, I thought that it was a perfectly legitimate, in the moral sense, war at the time. Yes, we have to admit that the aftermath was chaotic, if not catastrophic, but the reasons for that, in my judgment, were not the fact of the war itself, but the fact that the Americans, and indeed Britain and Australia, had a plan for the war, but no adequate plan for the peace. The Americans, it seemed, assumed that the people they'd been dealing with, such as a fellow called Shalabi, had widespread support in Iraq. It turned out he didn't. And with the wisdom of hindsight, indeed, even at the time, the better view was that if the Americans, for their own reasons, could not contemplate the restoration of the monarchy, the best thing would have been to have found the least bad of Saddam's generals and said, you run the joint on two conditions: A, no genocide against your own people, and B, no terrorism against ours, and we'll give you whatever support you need. If we come to the current conflict in Iran, well, I can't think of a better cause, frankly, than A, ridding the world of the threat of Iranian nuclear weapons, B, utterly destroying the Iranian war machine, which is a menace not just to Israel, but also to Israel's neighbours, as we have seen in this current conflict, and ultimately to the wider world, and C, saving the Iranian people and ultimately the wider world from a monstrous theocracy that is bent on a global caliphate. So I think this is a clear case of a just war, ultimately a war of self-defense. And while you can argue about individual aspects, while you can talk about the ramifications for things like fuel prices here in Australia and the ultimate standing of the United States vis-a-vis other countries such as China, I think its ultimate objectives are not just defensible but right. And I think that it does need to be taken through to a satisfactory conclusion. And the only satisfactory conclusion, in my view, is A, the total destruction of the Iranian war machine, and B, the maintenance of freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. And I suspect that the only way that's going to happen is if there really is regime change, because even a chastened theocracy, I suspect, will remain resolved on its foundational purposes, which appear to be the total destruction of Israel and, if possible, the creation of a global caliphate.
So, I understand everything you've said. Over the last 6 or 7 weeks, what has become interesting has been the concept that America was under threat because Israel was immediately under threat. So if Israel is under threat, then America is. That was the first proposition. That seemed to be followed by a proposition around nuclear arms and prevention of Iran having its nuclear capacity. Mm-hmm. Now it seems to have moved into oil. And the media obviously creates all sorts of conversations, and then it's the whole Venezuela picture. And, America's trying to control Venezuela, then it wants to control Cuba, and it's all because it wants to gain some leverage over China. So it's all incredibly fascinating. It's all actually, frankly, incredibly confusing. And it just is alarming that so many of us are left so confused by what is actually happening. Do you relate to that?
Look, yes and no, Giles. There's no doubt that President Trump in particular is not very good at developing a script and sticking to it. He speaks constantly. I think that whatever criticisms you might have of the president, you can't say that he doesn't say the first thing that comes into his head. I think what he says today is what he genuinely thinks right now.
Yeah, and it might be different in 10 minutes.
It might be different tomorrow, but it seems to me pretty clear, if not crystal clear, that America's war aims are A, to totally destroy the Iranian war machine, in particular to ensure that Iran never gets nuclear weapons, and B, if possible, to bring about regime change while at the same time protecting and preserving freedom of navigation in the Gulf and the rights of Iran's neighbours, many of whom are American allies and partners, to go about their business. Now, as long as a country which proclaims again and again that its fundamental objective is death to the little Satan, death to the great Satan, death to Israel, death to America, death to Britain, such a country is hardly going to be an ideal global citizen. Now, you can say, oh, they don't really mean it. Well, hang on a minute. If they don't really mean it, why have they spent so many untold billions creating and supplying proxies like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like the Houthis, so many untold billions building these underground rocket factories, the nuclear installations and so on. I mean, plainly, this theocracy has to be taken seriously when it talks about death to the little Satan, death to the great Satan. And my anxiety at the moment, with the war about 6 or 7 weeks old, is that pressure from other countries, domestic pressure, could cause the president's will to weaken and waver, and we could be left with a wounded but still extant Iranian regime. And as we know, a wounded animal can be a very dangerous one.
So then I go back to the whole question around Ukraine and Russia and back into the theme of the Middle East war. Is it all about food security and fuel security as well? Or how much of that is within the wish of the entities that are the aggressors or the defenders? Because you've spoken about that in the Australian today.
Yeah, well, look, these things are all very important, and a country like Australia, for prudential reasons, needs to ensure that in the event of a major disruption to global supply lines, we are not left high and dry. And we've been warned for a decade and a half now that we were in all sorts of trouble, lacking 90 days of liquid fuel reserves here on shore. Now, the line that I reluctantly accepted in my time as Prime Minister was that efficient global supply chains have really changed the situation to our benefit. We really should have learned through the COVID experience that in an emergency, it's every country for itself, and that these so-called efficient global supply lines can break down in a heartbeat. Now, the Ukraine conflict certainly interfered with the food security of Africa. The Iran conflict is interfering with the fuel security of much of the world. And should there ever be a conflict in the East China Sea, particularly over the Straits of Taiwan, well, that will be catastrophic for almost all forms of seaborne trade, and indeed much airborne trade, simply because no ships will move and not that many planes will take off, at least in the immediate aftermath of the outbreak of conflict. So for a country like Australia, for prudential reasons, we've got to look after our fuel security, given our dependence upon imports now and for the foreseeable future. On the other hand, in the end, so much of the conflict taking place in the world today, I think, does have a moral background as well as a prudential background. And in the case of the Ukraine war, clearly Russia is the aggressor, and the Ukrainians are valiantly, heroically defending their national freedom and independence. In the case of the Iran war, clearly Iran is the malefactor. It's the problem. And I think that America and Israel, however ham-fistedly and with however many unfortunate ramifications, are essentially doing the world a favour. Now, there are other conflicts in the world today, and something we briefly talked about off-air, Giles, the Sudan conflict, yes, for instance. Yeah. Now, I guess these conflicts are perhaps less morally clear. I once described the internal fight in Syria as baddies versus baddies. On reflection, I came to the view that it was actually baddies versus worsies, and we probably should have taken more of a position on that. In terms of the Sudan, obviously there is a humanitarian disaster taking place, but it's hard to know which side, if either of them, if any of them, are more or less on the side of the angels. And that's why I think it's more difficult for decent countries to get involved because you don't want to take one side only to find that you've created a monster. If we go back to the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan back in the 1980s, because it was Soviet Russia that was doing the invading, the West, particularly America, took the view that the principal opponents of Soviet Russia were worth supporting. Well, the principal opponents turned out to be the Taliban, and it may well be that America helped to create the monster that ultimately wrecked the September the 11th atrocity against the United States. So you've got to be, I think, determined to try to create a better world. But sometimes, particularly from the sidelines, it's very hard to know exactly how that's best done. Therefore, we should be slow to start and to join these conflicts. But once we're in them, it's normally pretty important to win, because if the world's liberal democracies don't prevail, that almost inevitably will strengthen the world's dictatorships. And as I keep saying to people who fret about what the United States is doing, sure, you might have your issues, but let's never forget that a world dominated by America looks more like America. A world dominated by China will look more like China. And the fact that almost everyone who knows the Chinese regime well, wants to get assets out of China, wants to get houses in Western countries, wants to get their kids educated in Western universities. If there were no other sign of the monstrosity of the Chinese regime, that surely would be it.
I mean, there is a concern, though, at the moment that sort of objectively the way the Chinese and the Russians would be looking at President Trump's behaviour that might sometimes be described as erratic, that's kind of helping autocracies develop as a model compared to democracy. And is there a question around an ideal form of democracy, or is it just ideal that it's represented by different countries in different ways? And how threatened are we?
Well, while I certainly wouldn't say that every element of US foreign policy or every element of Israeli foreign policy or every action by the Israeli or the United States Armed Forces is perfect, I think it's quite wrong to have a sort of position of moral equivalency between America and Israel on the one hand, both of them fundamentally decent societies, both of them in the marrow of their bones liberal democratic countries, and their various opponents. Iran is a murderous theocracy. China is a communist dictatorship. Russia under Putin is a militaristic dictatorship, and all three of those countries will attack their neighbours, will murder their internal opponents with merciless intensity, because what matters to them in ways that are certainly not the case with your standard liberal democracy, really all that matters to them is regime survival and national or ideological aggrandizement.
So can I ask you, back in 2014, you chaired the G20 in Brisbane. How was that for you personally as an Australian Prime Minister?
Well, it was a wonderful thrill, I suppose, to be chairing such a high-powered gathering. And there were all sorts of, I guess, interesting exchanges, both in the meetings and on the margins of the central meeting. I think it was much easier then to think that the world was a relatively benign place. Certainly back in 2014, I think it was still possible to regard China as being on a liberalising path as opposed to lapsing back into a form of totalitarianism. But look, it was a great honour, Giles. It really was a great honour. I wish I'd lasted long enough as Prime Minister to chair another one, but I guess they only come round once every 20 years, don't they?
Well, that's right. And also, I mean, it sort of comes back to our democracy. I mean, you're in the paper today talking about the Prime Minister's begging mission up in Asia about fuel security. And the one observation might be that the representation through the press of what occurred for all of us about the deal, if you like, that Mr. Albanese has created, and relate that back to the underlying fact is our democracy challenged by media law? Is media law tight enough? Is it good enough in this country to help us all understand what we're all dealing with?
Look, while naturally I'm a supporter of the rule of law, I feel less enthusiastic about the rule of lawyers. And there are many things that happen in Australia today which I think have over legalised, if you like, things. I mean, take something like these pro-Hamas marches that we've had on the streets of most of our major cities in recent times, replete with cries to globalise the Intifada, death, death to the IDF, and so on. Whether such things take place, I think, should really be a political decision as opposed to a judicial decision. Frankly, if I were in the New South Wales Parliament, I would probably be passing a law that says something like this, that whether a march or anything else that in the opinion of the police commissioner or in the opinion of the police minister is going to be detrimental to public safety and convenience, the minister can ban it. Now, if 4 years down the track, people thought that the relevant minister had been acting in an authoritarian or high-handed manner, well, then they can vote out the government. Simple as that. But I think it's problematic for our system where, as was the case with some of these Hamas marches, the Premier made it clear he didn't want the march to go ahead. The elected and accountable Premier made it clear that he didn't want the march to go ahead. And then the judges said, well, no, actually, you can't because of X, Y, and Z ban the march. I mean, I do think that and I know that the separation of powers doctrine is only imperfectly embodied in our system, given that the executive is in the legislature in a way that isn't the case in other systems. I do think that by and large, the different arms of government should stay in their lane. The Parliament should pass the laws. The executive should make what are the executive decisions proper to preserve the national interest in a country such as ours. And then the judiciary should be interpreting the laws while respecting the fact that what were once called prerogative powers, what were once called kingly powers, should not lightly be interfered with.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's sort of a weakening of society in one level and a strengthening in another. There's a sort of idea of a civilised society is governed by the rule of law. But then at the same time, you've got threats to our safety. But then the question is, who's our safety and who are Australians? And there's obviously a huge Angus Taylor at the moment is making a very big statement about immigration. So do you agree with his criticisms of the way the Labor government has been dealing with immigration over the last 3 years?
Well, I think all governments have been mishandling immigration. I think that it's been clear for quite some time to use Angus Taylor's words, that the numbers are too high and the quality is too low. And again, if the elected and accountable minister believes that a visa holder should have his or her visa revoked on national interest grounds, well, that ought to be the end of the matter. The minister should be able to revoke the visa of someone who is not an Australian citizen, more or less on his or her discretion. And I think it's a real pity when you've got people who have plainly broken Australian law on multiple occasions, effectively being protected by a legal system which I think is open to abuse. I mean, we've got rules which are initially applied by public servants. I think the public servants are decent people who try to be fair. When they've made a decision, if it's adverse, well, first of all, you can go to a tribunal, then you can go to the federal court, then you can go on appeal. And the practical result of this is that people can stay in this country for decades when they really have no foundational right to. So you can understand why people get very frustrated. And while in the end, yes, we have to respect the separation of powers, we have to respect, I guess, the prerogatives of the courts. In the end, if we want our democracy to survive, it rests on the consent of the people. And if the people think that their vote has become meaningless because it doesn't matter who they vote for, the Canberra bubble or the blob or the swamp, whatever you like to call it, is really in charge, that's a problem too. So in the end, I suppose what I'm saying is there's got to be a bit of give and take. And I suspect that the legal fraternity of a generation or two back would have been a lot less eager to rush into what might be considered contentious areas where the law and politics intersect.
So Alexander Downer was in the paper today talking about the progressive left and talking about how the politics of the current government is in effect a vote-winning exercise, and it's all about domestic policy. Mm-hmm. So how does our democracy how's the model of our democracy here facilitating and allowing what we would say decisions like that for vote-winning purposes, if that is in fact the case relative to how it could be?
Yeah. Well, I think Alexander's point today was that the policy of the current federal government in the Middle East was too responsive to electoral issues in Western Sydney and Western Melbourne, and the impact of the Muslim vote, if you like, than proper consideration of the national interest. I think that was Alexander's point. And look, I think he's right. I think that the Albanese government has departed from 7 decades of bipartisanship on Israel, mostly because some of its senior members are worried about the Muslim vote in their seats. And I think that's a pity. I think political issues in this country should be judged by the standards of this country, not by the standards of other countries from which some of your electors might once have come. But I think there's a much bigger problem than that, and that is the way successive governments over at least 2 or 3 decades have devolved decision-making to unelected and unaccountable bodies, whether this is planning bodies, whether it's the public service, whether it's quongos of one sort or another. It's gone much further in Britain, I think, than in most other countries, but it's a problem in all of the Anglosphere countries. You'll go and see a politician. The politician will say, well, yes, I absolutely see your point, but I'm afraid it's out of my hands. It's in the hands of the Planning Commission. Or on this issue, it's actually the departmental secretary who makes the decision, not me. I'm sorry, we passed a law 20 years ago, which means that the courts have made that decision as opposed to the government of the day making that decision. So I do think that good government in today's circumstances is going to require the bringing back of a lot of practical decision-making into the hands of the elected and accountable politician. I mean, I've got to say, I was a minister for most of the Howard years, and I was more than happy to make decisions. Unfortunately, I think there are too many politicians these days who would rather palm off the decision to someone else so they can be all care and no responsibility. But I think in the long run, that's bad for democracy. If the minister believes that something ought to be done, if the government believes that something ought to be done, well, the minister and or the government should be able to do it. And if the public don't like it, well, let the public express that view in an election.
So there's a dimension to my podcast that I didn't understand until very recently, but there are students at University of Queensland that are related to my family members that are listening to it, and my son is in the military. So you and I, we're not a dissimilar age, but what are we able to say to the generation that's leaving school and going to university and going on to professional qualifications about when they get to my age, mid-50s, what they've got to look forward to? and how do they live in this society and remain optimistic when...
Well, Giles, good question. And I suppose all of us start to ponder that when we get to the age of having adult children or maybe even grandchildren. We sit on the porch as we get older and think, what sort of a country have we left to our successors? Now, the fact that millions of people would come to Australia to live if they could suggests to me that whatever our faults and failings, we remain one of the best, if not the best countries on earth. The fact that Australia, Britain, America have borders under siege, if you like, from people wanting to flock in is ultimately a great tribute to our countries. So I would say to my kids' generation, your kids' generation, Giles, don't despair. Don't despair. Be confident that the foundations are strong, and do your best in your time to build on our strengths. And where you think that our generation, your parents and grandparents, have stuffed up, well, learn the right lessons and avoid our mistakes. And as I said, I think one of the big mistakes that we've made in the last couple of decades is we have diluted our democracy by taking too many decisions out of the hands of the elected and accountable politicians and putting them into the hands of judges, bureaucrats, quongos, etc. And I think that needs to be clawed back. But look, the Anglo-Celtic core culture, it's the world's most welcoming. The Judeo-Christian foundational ethos, it's the world's most universal. It's why people like the place and want to join us. Now, we have to be careful that in welcoming people in, we don't, as it were, change the character of the place too much, because insufficient numbers, newcomers, do substantially change even very well-established countries like ours. But nevertheless, you've got to be optimistic about Australia, because if you can't be optimistic about Australia, you can't be optimistic about anywhere.
No, I would agree with that. But do they have to have a different view about life than we might have done? I mean, we were a little bit more, I suppose, relaxed as we were growing up, but there seemed to be the thing of, threats to employment by AI, and then it just seems to be a confusing world. Or is it maybe just that's from a person who's now older? And
well, look, I think you go back to ancient Athens. I mean, Socrates is supposed to have despaired of the youth, isn't he? I mean, I think all of us have a tendency to look back with nostalgia on the good old days, and there is no doubt that some times have been better than others. I mean, look at the Roman Empire at its height. For all its brutality, it was extraordinarily advanced in not just technological, but even in sort of questions of jurisprudence and other big questions. Then, of course, the world, or at least the formerly Roman world, sank into the Dark Ages. Look at Western Europe. I mean, the period of the 30 Years' War was a horrible, horrible time. So there is no doubt that some times are better than others. Objectively, I would say that the world in 2020, just prior to the pandemic, was more fair, more free, more rich, and more safe for more people than at any other time in history. So there's much to be proud of in achievement. There's a bit to be frustrated about in the present, but in the end, I just think that we have got to give it our best shot to make a difference. I mean, I like to think that Australia has been characterised by the idea of the fair go and the injunction to have a go. I mean, we've believed that everyone in this country should be given a fair go, but we've appreciated that unless more of us have a go, things won't be as good as they should be.
What about at an individual level? Yeah. I'm an Englishman who's migrated here 30 years ago, but you've been sort of present in my life as a leader in politics and displaying sort of courage with your opinions. What do we say to young people about being courageous and fearless in life?
Well, keep it up. I mean, when I was a very new politician, one of my elders and betters said to me, it's always the things you don't do in politics that you regret, not the things you do. That's why I think it's incredibly important that we say to young people, never be afraid to have a go. And if something needs to be said, have the guts to say it. Now, if having said it, you then think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have, or actually maybe I was a bit over the top, or actually maybe I got that wrong, or actually I've thought of more things since then which perhaps cast the whole thing in a different light. That's fair enough.
And say so.
That's fair enough. I mean, if we do something, say something, which on reflection we think is wrong, well, then we say sorry. Again, that's common sense. I mean, the great strength of Western civilization over the centuries has been that we don't think any of us has the last word in wisdom and knowledge. We have been, until recently at least, insatiably curious, and that should continue. We should always be striving to come to a better appreciation of what is and what might be. My worry is that self-critical faculty, which I used to think would be our salvation, in recent times has metastasized into a self-loathing faculty, if you like, which is very corrosive. But still, as I said a moment ago, Giles, I just think that you've got to be optimistic about Australia, because if you can't be optimistic about this country, you can't be optimistic about anywhere.
Tony, thank you so much. It's been an absolute honour of mine. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you,
Giles.
Giles.
Thank you for coming. So that brings us to the end of the episode today. Thank you very much for listening. Please look for cross-examination_podcast on YouTube and share it with others. We will be back soon with more interesting conversations with fascinating people. Thank you again, and speak to you soon.